Welcome to the Scrum.org Community Podcast, the podcast from the home of Scrum. In this podcast, Agile experts, including professional Scrum trainers and other industry thought leaders, share their stories and experiences. We also explore hot topics in our space with thought-provoking, challenging, energetic discussions. We hope you enjoy this episode.
Hello and welcome to the Scrum.org Community Podcast. I'm your host, Dave West, CEO here at Scrum.org. In today's podcast, we are talking with Dr. Mik Kersten. This is actually the second podcast, so some of you may have listened to the first one. But the first one, we explored the motivation and high-level structure of Mik's new book, Output to Outcome, which is an awesome book. Luckily, I got to see it before the world and provide some feedback. Anyway, today, we're going to continue that conversation and really lean into leadership and organization structures in this new age. And the book really does describe many changes that Mik was seeing in organizations that were becoming more AI-centric, etc. Anyway, welcome to the podcast, Mik.
Thank you. It's great to be back, Dave, and to be talking about this topic that I think is on everyone's mind right now.
It really, really is. But before we jump into it, just to wait, everybody, I know you're excited about this. Can we first just give a recap for our listeners about the book? Tell us, sort of what the book is about, but keep it brief because you can always listen, obviously, to the first podcast.
Yeah, absolutely. So with the Project to Product book, which I thank you for your help on that book as well as with Output to Outcome, Dave, with all your critical and great feedback that I think made both books better. But with that book, I was focused on defining a product operating model. So basically bringing some of these concepts of agility to, they were always supposed to be part of the business, but really that never quite transpired the way we expected. So connecting business and technology in value streams and organizational designs that really around long-lived product life cycles and innovation. And of course, really with that whole generation of focus on developer productivity and value streams and flow, we were working in a world of constrained output, right? Prioritization of features was really important. Management of roadmaps around scarce development resources and technology resources was really important. And then around the end of 2022, all of that just blew up, right? All of a sudden, we were staring at a future where outputs were becoming effectively free or the cost of tokens or electricity, where coding was no longer the constraint. And I realized as I was building my own agentic frameworks, working at that point in time as the Chief Technology Officer of PlanView after the acquisition of TaskTop, that as we were building these things, we needed a whole new operating model because we were not constrained around what we were building, really the outputs, the features that we were delivering. We were really more constrained about whether we were building the right things, whether we were delivering the right outcomes. And so it made me realize that we needed a new operating model where some of the concepts that come from Lean and Agile and Scrum still very much apply, but they apply in this whole new world where we need to optimize not for what the next feature is, what the next roadmap item is, but whether we're delivering outcomes in this amplified world of abundant outputs. And that's really the goal of the book, Output to Outcome. It's an operating model for the age of AI.
And a way of adopting it, which I thought was particularly strong, which we don't often see. So when we left the last podcast, we sort of finished it with, we really need to talk more about leadership and the changes that are necessary. And maybe we're seeing some of them in organizations as they move to this more outcome-centric world. So if you were going to describe the characteristics of one of these new age leaders, what would it be? What would they be?
Yeah, so I think this was, for me, by the way, the book has, as you mentioned, Dave, all of this very concrete advice on how to apply various aspects of operating models to leverage the amplification of AI. And the last one is called Makers to Managers. Yeah. And that was by far the hardest one to write. It probably took me 4 times, 5 times the amount of time, it's not any longer, the amount of time to write it, because we're still seeing all of this evolve. But I think one of the things that we're absolutely seeing is that what used to be a managerial role, as I was looking at organizations that actually became very good at this, has become more of a hands-on role. We're seeing in organizations that leaders who were kind of delegating all the AI stuff to their teams and their staff were not moving the organizations forward at the same pace as leaders who are getting very hands-on. and actually building things. And so that's why I titled that chapter Managers to Makers, because we're now, thanks to what you can actually do with AI, there's now this component of getting hands-on and working directly with both the technology and then actually with what you're building in the company. At the same rate, the role of individual contributors has changed completely, right? Because now the individual contributor roles they're getting transformed as well, because your individual contributors, let's say developers, designers, business analysts, they're actually now working with teams of agents. And their job has become actually less hands-on in terms of building things directly, and it involves a lot more coordination with other parts of the organization. You can no longer be a Scrum Master, an engineering manager, or just a product owner and not communicate with other parts of the organization, right? Because that basically your work's been elevated, and once it's elevated, you're actually individual contributors are getting elevated to more leadership and communication collaboration roles. So I think the number one thing I'm seeing is this blending of roles, where there's no longer just a hands-on individual contributor coder role, and there's no longer the executive who just expects their teams to do everything and not to need to understand some of the underlying dynamics and technologies that come with AI.
But doesn't that just increase the complexity in an organization? So imagine that now I was a developer just working in a nice little Scrum team, and I was building stuff. And now suddenly I'm now orchestrating. My team is no longer in existence. It's disappeared. And I've got a series of agents that I'm working with. Maybe I'm responsible for delivering a feature or set of features. Now, suddenly I'm now going to have to interface with a bunch of other teams or other individuals who are working with agents, etc. And then there's a level of coordination and complexity that's going to create. Doesn't it just make the whole organization more complex?
Yeah, I think that's exactly what we're seeing, is that the result of this, of what we just talked about, is just a dramatic increase in the complexity of organizations, to the point where everyone's busier, you've got way more dependencies, way more, your communication architecture is exploding and then of course with that come high coordination costs, because all of a sudden, to understand what's happening in this part of the organization, you have to now have many more meetings or many more agents providing summaries and so on. But I think what we're seeing, and this is absolutely true with across the organizations I work with today, is that complexity is growing rapidly in these organizations, and it's actually becoming a problem to the point where that complexity is creating the bottleneck on delivering outputs and outcomes. So I actually think a lot of organizations, especially at larger scales, not these new organizations that have grown up fully AI native with a small number of people that have grown into a set of teams, but these large organizations, I think we're seeing a very rapid and dramatic rise in complexity, which is actually becoming the biggest impediment to leveraging AI.
And do you think that's to some extent the reason why we're not seeing huge productivity gains? Actually, productivity is the wrong word. Value gains, because you can be very productive and not deliver much value, as we all had days like that, don't we? But we aren't seeing those huge value jumps. So and it just manifests itself. For instance, you log onto your bank website. I don't know about you, but my bank website's not changed much in the last 18 months. And you'd think that it would be changing a lot, or your insurance, or your cable company, or your cell phone. All of these places where you directly interface with the systems of things you use on a day by day basis. I haven't seen much change. I haven't had a moment of wow yet. I don't know about you. Is that the reason? Because basically what we've done is create these incredibly complex organizations that are now, sort of boiling over almost internally.
Yeah, so I think what we're all observing is we're not seeing, especially in these large organizations, the productivity, the value benefits yet, right? Like, are they actually delivering outcomes to you and me as consumers faster? The fact that when I switched cellular plans in Canada 2 weeks ago, I was on the phone for 4.5 hours.
Wow.
Evidence to that fact. But I think anecdotally, we're seeing that, right? We're not seeing this massive transformation of the kind of the software services that we're consuming day to day yet. We're of course seeing this explosion within AI native companies and frontier labs and models, but it's not percolated yet. And I think I think we're all witnessing right now this AI productivity paradox, right?
Yeah.
Where some companies are very good at this, and they do tend to be the kind of frontier AI native, and to some degree, I think that the hyperscalers as well. But I think even they have some challenges. And I think the other interesting thing to observe is that it's not because the token consumption is not there, right? These companies are already, and as witnessed by Anthropic's revenue growth, right? They're already consuming many tokens, so that the kind of output production parts are there, but the outcome and value pieces are not there yet. And to answer your question, I absolutely think that's it. It's like, I think the organization itself has become the constraint. And it's become, the organizational structures and models that we created have just not scaled and not adapted to the kind of complexity that we now have because of agents and AI.
And I do want to come back to leadership, but before we do that, I just want to say, told you so, because what we found in Agile is that the things that stopped Agile from scaling are the things that are now stopping AI and increased productivity. Not a clear understanding of the customer, not empowered teams that can actually deliver value out into the customer ASAP. You've got poorly tuned measurement systems, and the crux is those blooming dependencies, because you're aligned around systems, not around outcomes. And your book obviously talks a lot about that. So, told you so.
I think one of the most important new jobs of leadership is to unwind this complexity and to help restructure organizations around us. And I think this has to happen both bottom up with those people who have become now, managers delivering a whole new amount and level of outputs, making sure that they're delivering not substance to their customers, not slop, as well as top down in terms of the actual organizational designs that enable this kind of scaling. So just to touch on one thing that you're saying, Dave, without decentralized ownership, you just can't scale, right? It's just like no systems truly scale without empowerment, ownership, and some kind of encapsulation, whether we're talking about nature or organizations. I think we're now at this crux where the kind of AI and token spend is growing dramatically, but the results are not there, other than for organizations that have been structured for the ground up for this.
I even question some of those, actually, because what I'm seeing is the only people that seem to be benefiting from AI at the moment are the AI companies, really, and maybe a few others like the Teslas of the world. But let's go back to that leadership question, because, all right, you were sort of highlighting the number one responsibility of leadership is to reduce, in this new world, is to reduce complexity. And then you started talking about a few tips for that. One is empowered teams. There was obviously an architectural element with respect to dependencies. One is around measures and incentives.
So I think those are some of the key tools. And I think if we think about where we need the organization to end up, it's in a place where we can leverage all of that amplification, right? Yeah. So that's kind of the end state, is where each team is empowered to deliver outcomes independently, to do things like, in the end, delivering outcomes and producing value for a customer or a market is all around kind of the hypothesis testing of, if we deliver this thing, will it help satisfy our customers and make them happier, and so on. So there's, underneath all of this, there's this kind of feedback loop that we need, which in Output.com is called the outcome loop, of delivering value. Basically, taking inputs around your strategy and your budgets, doing all the activities with teams and agents that produce artifacts that flow to the customer, and then getting feedback on whether this is what delighted the customer, this is what made them buy more or renew or drive other business outcomes. And in the process, there's another key aspect of the outcome loop, which is to make sure that the humans doing the building, involved with the agents, that we're also delivering outcomes to them. So outcomes are both employee and business outcomes. Mm-hmm. And in the end, I think the new role of the leader, so if we think about this outcome loop, which we've had various versions of that and all of those sorts of things, I think the new job of the leader is to kind of understand the outcome loop and apply the theory of constraints to the outcome loop. So basically, the theory of constraints means that for any complex system, there's always a main constraint, or sometimes it can be kind of a chain of these constraints that really impedes delivering value through that system, delivering flow and value through that system. And so leaders need to understand is what's the constraint? Is the constraint that people are not properly empowered or trained on leveraging agents? Or is it that the feedback loop is not closed? So teams can only deliver one thing and get feedback, whereas if you look at some AI natives, they'll actually hypothesis test in parallel and deliver 10 versions of a feature or 5 versions of a mobile experience rather than one, and get all of that feedback and discard what was least beloved by the customers. So I think the key thing is we need to ensure that there's, in the end, the job of leadership is to take impediments out of the way of the teams. In the end, I guess the premise, which I think we both share, is that this is all around empowering and enabling teams. There's another question, is that team now, 5 plus minus 2, or is that team 2 plus minus 1? How many people are on these sorts of teams? But I do think one thing that remains throughout this new way of building with AI is empowering and enabling teams.
Okay, so just I want to come back to what do orgs look like, but I think I just want to make sure our listeners, something that even though I've read the book and I kind of now remember thinking that, but I forgot it because I obviously moved on to the next page. But this idea that leadership is all about managing that outcome loop and applying the theory of constraints to it. So what's impeding that outcome loop, as it were, in respect to the thing that we're trying to satisfy, the outcome we're trying to realize or change in some way, shape, or form. And ultimately, if we do a systematic approach to that, you'll identify some of the things very quickly that are getting in the way. And some of it might be around transparency of feedback. Some of it might be around, you can't release frequently because of a massive amount of dependencies, et cetera, et cetera.
Yeah, and to kind of simplify it a little bit, or just take the simple example, let's just take one team, right?
Yeah.
With a single team. And I think it is important that the structure of teams will evolve. I think some of what's happening is people will assume, it'll be a person doing everything. But no matter what, I believe we're going to organize ourselves into teams, right? And that's where I think the kind of concepts and principles of Scrum are just as important, because they're organizing principles for people. Now, those principles now need to include agents, right? Yeah. But I don't know about you, but I don't want to be working by myself with 10,000 agents and not talking to anyone ever, right? We can touch on this as to why this is, because I think a new type of leadership structure will emerge, but that leadership structure is still around connecting kind of the intentions of people to deliver outcomes with AI. And so there is some kind of organizational team structure. It's just maybe different than the one that we saw in the age of, in previous management ages. So I think in the end, the role at the lowest level, and I really do think of this stuff as a kind of, and we'll get into this, the structure in a moment, but as a self-similar kind of a hierarchical structure. And at the lowest level of that structure, the leaves of that structure are these teams of humans and agents delivering value, and that team needs a leader. Whatever size that team is, however many people or agents it is, that team needs a leader who's taking away the impediments. And the impediments can be any of those, the inputs, the outputs, or the outcomes of the loop, right? The input impediments is maybe the team doesn't have enough budget to spend on tokens, right? So that's you need a budget input. Maybe if it has enough budget, on the output part, you've got one person using all the tokens, and the other 4 people, they actually need upskilling and training, and you want to help upskill them so that they're able to leverage AI to produce all these outputs. And of course, the most important part for the leaders is to make sure that everything's connected to outcomes, because otherwise the teams may as well just be delivering slop or things that are not aligned if the team and the leader of that team are not able to connect the outputs being delivered with AI to outcomes for the customer, be that an internal or an external customer, be that a public company or a government organization. So I think that is the job of the leader. And of course, and Dave, to your point, that can be a complex job, because I want to touch on the point of dependencies right now, because we just looked at that team as a single unit, but we know as things scale, they're not a single unit. There's going to be another team and another part of the organization, and someone providing data and APIs, and those will be a dependency. And sometimes we'll have dependencies between organizations and so on. So I think the other key thing is we need a scaling structure that works when you've got all of this amplified output, and you need to manage it across teams. And that's the next job for leadership.
Yeah, which is incredibly complicated and incredibly hard. I was talking to a large Dutch bank the other day that are really wrestling with this because at the moment they've aligned their organization. So they've done what every single company in the world has done that's not native AI. What they've done is they've reduced the size, they've taken 25% off their staff, got rid of, they've reduced the size of their teams. But the teams are still aligned around the existing systems, because you've got expertise in system, RP150, ZX2. If you've sort of got these skill centers, that's all they can do is they're focused on that. And then they use SAFe. And what they've been doing historically is then this epic is then translated into work in all the backlogs in all these teams. And what they've found is as they've increased the productivity of those teams, the demand side, which you could argue is the portfolio planning or lean portfolio planning in SAFe, has not kept up with it. But also the biggest problem is the coordination overhead has risen. So one of their solutions is to reduce the number of teams so that there's less cross-team dependencies, and then the team is empowered to resolve those things, which is definitely helped to some extent. However, even inside the team, you've got a level of overhead of coordination across, these people that are driving, 5-6 agents to build something or to create something. And then when you add the complexity of multi-hypothesis, so we believe it could be this or it could be that, let's test it. I guess even more complicated because it's great if a test runs within the same boundary of dependency, but if it crosses boundaries of dependency, then it just sort of amplifies the complexity. So it just, because now you've got to have a whole different group that needs to be aware of the other thing because you're doing the other thing and they're dependent, and it becomes even more hard. So they're wrestling with this, and I don't think there seems to be any simple answers at the moment. Have you got the sort of holy grail of scaling?
I think that's the right question, is what's the holy grail of scaling? Like, where else can we look in systems that we've kind of studied and understand where we're seeing this kind of problem? And so, for example, we know in the earlier days of building software that there's this problem of coupling of systems, right?
Yeah.
Where the analogy is that if you didn't have a well-structured software system, you'd have an architecture, if you're going to take an X-ray diagram of your software in an MRI, that actually looked like a plate of spaghetti, right? Like everything was connected to everything else, everything was wired to everything else. And it's incredibly hard to scale those and change those systems, right? Those are why so many companies have had to undergo like really large replatformings. And really this process is of taking a system that's way too intertwined and everything's interdependent and connected, and changing that system to be modular. Where modularity in software, but also in Lego and in nature, means that you've got low coupling. So the different parts of the system are more independent, right? Like when I'm playing Lego, I can remove a brick from the top of a building and not have the foundation on the next building collapse. Whereas if you have a highly coupled organization, that's not the case. You move one thing over here, and all of a sudden you've triggered all these wait states or problems for someone else, or there's not the right kind of data that needs to be ingested by this agent or this report or something of that sort, or something can't authenticate. So I think the solution that we've seen in complex system that scale is modularity, which means, again, lowering the coupling, which is just lowering dependencies between the parts of the system. And of course, the system we're talking about now is teams, by the way, which is interesting, or sets of teams. And then increasing the cohesion. So cohesion means that like parts, like functionality come together. So you've got kind of a more durable way of keeping low coupling. So if that's a system that you're able to like put, let's say like the data portions together and the kind of the multi-agent framework together over here and the front end pieces over there and things specific to one customer segment over there. I think there's this other, really important concept that was well understood and researched through the age of software, which is socio-technical congruence, is that system and the teams building that system have the same structure. And this is Conway's Law and reverse Conway's
Law, right?
Yeah, those sorts of things. So I think the only, and this, by the way, is covered, there's this incredible book, which gave me a lot of inspiration by Jeffrey West called Scale. It's about how natural systems scale.
It looks really interesting.
It's fascinating. And by the way, I think it would line up a lot with your thinking around organizations. And Jeff West, by the way, starts with natural systems, how they scale, and does go all the way to cities and companies and those sorts of things. And it did take me like a couple times picking it up because it's a very well written book. And he used to run the Santa Fe Institute. He spent a lot of time studying complexity. And these complex systems that work, right, have this very common structure of basically a self-similar, or to use a fancy word, fractal hierarchy. And that's whether that's our circulatory system that in the end is, just branches out from our lungs and heart to deliver oxygen to our various parts, or the metaphor I keep getting back to in output to outcome is the tree, right? Where you've got a trunk and then branches and smaller branches, and you're finally supporting the leaves. So you've got this primary hierarchy that scales and kind of has encapsulation at every level so that the parts can function independently. And that's really, I think, the key thing for our teams. The teams are the leaves of an organization. Now, of course, you can have a leaf attached to the trunk. The CEO can have their own team for experimentation or something of that sort. But you've got, in the end, the whole role of the organization is to just kind of support the autonomous function of each of those parts. Because at large scale, like when you have a really large tree, which you can with 100,000 leaves or more, you can't centrally coordinate any of that. This really is around creating a structure that supports decentralization. And that's what works in nature. And that's, I think, exactly the kind of mental model we need to have for how to scale organizations that now are doing, let's say, 10 or 100 times the amount of output with those teams. And the only way is this kind of, I think, hierarchical decomposition, kind of aligning ownership and autonomy to the teams. And the role of leadership is providing the right structure in terms of the right trunk that you've got. So
I actually, though it's a great analogy, I think the better analogy is to think about weeds. I hate to say that because I think that one of the biggest problems with trees is that they're slow to react to the environment. Obviously, they take a long time to grow. They also take a long time to die. They're incredible. I drive past a tree every day on the way to my son's school that's over 250 years old, which is just super. But what we almost need, I think, modern organizations is more like the ability to rapidly create weeds and to sort of deal with that they overcome your garden without, if you're away for 3 weeks. And because one of the biggest problems with cohesion and coupling is cohesion, is working, it's making the choices that you're cohesioning, whatever the word is there. Because most organizations spend a great deal of time. When we were looking at defining products, when we were looking at APOM, the Agile Product Operating Model, we spent a lot of time talking to organizations about the choices they made, particularly organizations where they had a large amount of legacy, and the choices that they were making actually made them. So the question is, how do you make the right choices around cohesion? Because I think that's the hardest thing. For instance, last week I was with a large government organization in Europe that might be involved in all sorts of things that we can't talk about. And they were, how do we align our teams? Because the amount of change in the world is sort of exponential. And if we do it via missions, that's great. But those missions are not necessarily valid by the time we've even formed the team. It was a really interesting question around cohesion. So what would you tell, how do you align?
Yeah, and I think it does go back to the teams, and I think we can call the teams weeds. Yeah, I think the thing with weeds is that they can kind of grow on their own as quickly as possible, right?
And that's the key.
Yeah, we want those leaves to grow as quickly as they can and as independently as they can. And in the end, it's those leaves, it's those teams that actually best understand the customer problem. They're kind of they're the ones getting the feedback, the most direct feedback, right? So I think, again, but this is not really that much different from Scrum. Like, we want to empower those teams as much as possible. And when those when there's kind of some signaling happening, they learn something, we might want the whole organization to learn. So even trees, like even the largest tree, like the coast redwoods, they have 100 million leaves. If the leaf starts experiencing water stress, these basically, they're like hormonal signals in our body, but there's like an acid goes through the whole tree that has every leaf start conserving water, right? So you can have in these large structures signals that cross the whole structure, because when you've got a kind of an efficiently leadership and organizational structure, you can deliver something that came from a leaf is like, we just learned this, that percolates all the way up to leadership, and then across the organization. There's this new technology, there's this new market pivot, we've got a new competitor, those sorts of things. So I think in the end, this truly is around, supporting all of that, all of those many, many leaves or weeds, and going and putting in place kind of the minimal structure that those teams need to support it, right? In the tree, that's kind of, the nutrients those things need, but the minimal leadership structure to support it. That doesn't answer the question of, that hard question of how do you organize that? Is it around missions? Is it around products? Is it around market segments? Is it around functional domains and those sorts of things? I think that's still a difficult job for leadership to identify how you organize this minimal structure above the teams, how you make it as shallow as possible, right? Amazon structure is extremely deep. It's, 9 or 10 levels deep, right? This hierarchical structure. But I think having a simple structure I think in the end, the thing that scales most is these hierarchies. They can be very broad hierarchies, right? Jensen Huang at NVIDIA famously has, 60 direct. So it can be very many, branches attached to the trunk and so on down. The branching structure can be very, very, very broad. We need these collaborations across teams. So we need that signaling across teams. But I think in the age of AI, we need to, those teams now need to be empowered more than ever. Like if the team wants to recreate a stack, let them recreate their own stack to avoid creating dependencies on 3 other teams, right? Which will slow them down. So I think we now need to over-calibrate to empowerment and ownership of teams, because if we don't, you get into this just gridlock. And I think a point I've heard you make, which is that you kind of fall back to kind of waterfall leadership styles where you're throwing things over to these teams that are then kind of producing so much, but actually gridlocked in terms of what they're able to deliver and how they're able to flow that information back into leadership. So
let's talk a little bit about that, because what I'm seeing increasingly, and it's really worrying, and yes, some of it is worrying because I run Scrum.org and I have a mortgage to pay, etc. But is the movement away from things like Scrum to more of a command and control situation? And the reason why is interesting. Okay, let me just start again. So I think what's really interesting, what I'm seeing a lot of organizations do at the moment, Mik, is actually go back to a command and control approach. So I was talking to a large insurance company, a medical insurance company in the US. And what they've done is ultimately they've discarded the use of Scrum and get rid of Scrum teams. And what they're doing is they're allocating features to individual developers, giving them tokens and as many agents as you can fill your desktop with. And they're allowing them, based on these very clear specifications, to build that. And what they're doing actually is moving, because of course, every feature is dependent on every other feature, because this is a complex stack of a lot of different technology. Then that's then coming up to the management to resolve those dependencies and to manage that sort of that critical path through the system. Because most of these systems are quite large, that means the chunk of value you can deliver at any one moment is actually relatively broad but shallow, as it were. Sort of like you can't do it very often because it has to do all these things. So ultimately, they're coordinating these very productive individuals, and the coordination is so complex that it reduces what they're all doing. And there's a lot of waiting because of that. So I'm seeing that. And the reason is because everybody's so concerned about optimizing productivity still at that token level, at that developer level. And they don't want to empower because they think that ultimately the complexity of the environment requires some sort of management oversight, or the risk of everybody working together is too large or whatever. So are you seeing similar situations?
Yes, I am. And I think it's actually very worrying, because what's happening is that so AI agents are coming. I think you touched on this briefly with the other organization that you visited. It's causing companies, and some of this is just a result of the increased token spend, putting pressure on headcount spend, right?
Yep.
So I think, but that's going to keep happening, right? That token and inference spend is just going to keep growing. And I think if things go as they normally do in these productivity paradoxes, we've seen these in prior technological ages as well, the kind of business growth is not going to be as fast as the spend on tokens, let's say, for these organizations adopting AI. So rather than building AI, right? They'll be happy with all the token spend that everyone can muster. So there's pressure on just the organizational size. And so it's, I think, exactly as you saw, there's like either cuts on middle management or cuts on teams, right? Where most of the headcount is on the teams. And I think what I'm seeing is it's being done in I would say like I'll just call it an irresponsible way. Irresponsible in the sense that it's going to actually take away from what worked in the organization and not replace it with something better, but replace it with something worse. And that's exactly what we're seeing in these organizations that are moving away from something, basically organizational design that was decentralized, right? Scrum provides decentralization and ownership. It has mechanisms for that. As soon as you pull that out and you don't replace it with another thing that provides decentralization and ownership and empowerment that properly cascades down, I think I'm seeing exactly what you saw, which is that these organizations are going back to command, control, and waterfall. And yet we, just from first principles and from all the Geoffrey West scale stuff we talked about, we know that doesn't scale. So they're putting in a worse scaling mechanism rather than a better one, because we know decentralization and ownership scales, and centralization doesn't, because those leaders are overrun. But I'm seeing this all over the place. It's like requirements documents are back. It's like centralizer. It's fascinating, right?
And AI is very good at building very long requirements documents.
That's right. And then so leaders are building those, and that work's being thrown over the fence. And then the kind of leadership is the bottleneck, rather than having empowered teams that actually kind of iterate with customers and with delivery. So I think that's a really interesting observation, Dave, which is that sort of, and it's a combination of organizations wanting to restructure and the cost pressures from the token spend that's causing them to, I think, put in play or just flip back to command and control organization designs that will then further get in their way. And I think this is very worrying, because in the end, what it means is these organizations will become less competitive and less productive and lose market share.
And I mean, evolution would indicate, outside of the controlled markets like finance and pharma, the barriers to building a business now are significantly less. Obviously, you've got people like Mark Andreessen trying to find this first, 2-person unicorn or whatever it is, or 3-person unicorn,
2-person company, and that will happen.
And they will. And for companies that don't have the security of regulations and standards, it's going to be almost impossible to compete, because you can't realign. And as you become more concerned about the spend, you'll reduce headcount and increase token usage, and that still won't solve that problem. So it will be a massive spiral. It really worries me, because many of these organizations are great companies with great legacies and great history.
That's right. And I think we want these companies to thrive, because otherwise too much of kind of value creation that's accruing from AI and kind of generating wealth just gets concentrated in too few companies who are good at this, which then makes, for just a less diverse and dynamic economy. I think one of the main jobs to be done is to figure out, define, and implement an organizational structure that's properly decentralized and provides this kind of ownership. And I think we're seeing kind of too much of throwing away of kind of the principles, let's say, of agile and team structures, and not replacing it with anything.
Yeah. And And I just also want to highlight another thing, and then, we've been talking for a while, so I'm going to have to wrap up this. One other important point is you're not going to get it right. So that means that you need to have a desire to be continuously inspecting and adapting that operating model, continually looking at it, looking at what the key indicators are for success, whether it's, those flow metrics that were in your previous book, which are awesome measures, or whether it's something else in the organization, attrition, burnout, whatever it is. But looking at those tricks and then trying to fine tune. I mean, ultimately, it's relatively easy to measure the success of the organization if you're in a technology company that's providing stuff to customers, because it's how frequently you're releasing to them and how impressed they are with the things that you're releasing. But obviously that's lagging indicators. Leading indicators might be a little bit more difficult to determine. So I think that is key. All right. So Mik, oh my gosh, you've blown my mind as always, and I really appreciate you taking the time to come on to the Scrum.org community podcast today. If in the last couple of minutes, if you're a leader today, you've sort of said, okay, your job is to solve this scaling problem and enable you to address the AI paradox or the productivity paradox of AI. And that ultimately means, thinking about outcomes, managing that flow of outcomes, removing impediments to those outcomes being delivered faster and faster and et cetera, et cetera. But what would be the place to begin? Where would I start?
So I think it's examining your operating model and kind of going from here to there, right? Understand various operating models. Understand the Dave, I think the agile product operating model and what's an output outcome, those things are highly aligned as we know. Just study these operating models that work. Study the ones that are kind of being leveraged at scale, whether it's at hyperscalers or AI natives. And I think in the end, define and design and implement your operating model around this kind of decentralization and cascade of ownership, autonomy, and empowerment for the teams. So I think that it's bringing all of your leaders together and just being very intentional around how are you going to design that. And I think the really important point that you made is just be very agile about it, because you're not going to get it right? You need a feedback loop, and that's what these operating models are. They're really all around signals and feedback loops. And output to outcome, it's called the outcome tree. These are all kind of very similar structures, but you need to examine that regularly to understand how it's affecting employee satisfaction, outputs, outcomes, all of that. Right now I think it's every month, maybe at some point when things are slower moving, every quarter. Evolve, adjust, and improve that model.
Yeah, we are. May you live in interesting times, Mik. It certainly is interesting times at the moment.
I feel like we are, yeah.
I'm sure they've always said it, but now our interesting times change on a daily basis, which is even harder. Thank you for spending the time on today's Scrum.org community podcast, Mik. It's an absolute pleasure. I just want to remind our listeners that the book is available, and definitely for pre-order. When does it come out, Mik? Remind me.
July 14th. And yeah, you can pre-order it now.
It's a fantastic read. It's got a picture of a tree on the front. What more would you want? I'd like to replace that with a bunch of weeds, but apparently it's not as
now you are making me think there's a stranger things happening along the bottom. Yeah. I'm going to ignore that. I never
yes, it does strike me. Maybe that's just worrying that I thought that straight away. It's the upside down already. But thank you for taking the time today, Mik.
Thank you so much, Dave. Great chatting.
And thank you for listening to today's Scrum.org community podcast. Obviously, we're on with Dr. Mik Kersten talking about his book, Output to Outcome. It is a fascinating read. And I think what it really does is highlight some of these friction points that organizations are going to see as we change the constraints that AI is providing, changing those bottlenecks and really changing many of our preconceived notions of what's important and what isn't in these new systems or in these new operating models. But if you liked what you heard, please subscribe, share with friends, and of course, come back and listen to some more. I'm lucky enough to have a variety of guests talking about everything in the area of professional Scrum, product thinking, agile, and a lot about AI now, must be said. So thanks, everybody, and Scrum on.